The day the estate lawyer handed me the keys to my grandmother's Muskoka cottage, I thought the hardest part was already behind me. Then my stepfather told me I was stealing from the family, and before it was over, a $42,000 secret would be read aloud at a Thanksgiving dinner table in front of people who'd spent months calling me selfish. My name is Cassidy. I'm 29, I work as a project coordinator for a civil engineering firm in Toronto, and I am not by nature a dramatic person. I pay my rent on time, I bring Tims to morning site meetings, I own one houseplant and I remember to water it. But I want to tell you about the 6 months that began with a registered land title and ended with my stepfather sitting in complete silence while the family lawyer explained, very calmly, that there was nothing left to negotiate. Before I get into it, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had a family member treat your hard work like their personal backstop, hit like and subscribe. You'll want to stay for what happens at the dinner table. My grandmother Frances was the person in my life who showed up. After my parents divorced when I was 6, my mother remarried fast, and it became clear pretty quickly that my stepfather Howard was there for his own son Aaron, 2 years older than me, and that I was a secondary arrangement in that household. My grandmother watched all of this and responded by pulling me into the orbit of something warmer. Every summer from the time I was 8, I spent 2 weeks at her cottage on Skeleton Lake, just north of Huntsville. She taught me to read the water before you paddled into it, to check the depth before you dived, and to read a contract before you signed your name. That last lesson, as it turned out, was the one that mattered most. When she passed in late spring, the estate lawyer read her will in his Huntsville office. She had been precise, her savings divided evenly among her children, her personal belongings to her church, and the cottage, 3 bedrooms, a half-acre lot, a wooden dock that stretched out over still water, transferred to me. Solely by name, with the land title registration already prepared and waiting. I cried on the drive back. Not only from grief, though there was a great deal of that, I cried because she had seen me clearly, she had written it down while she still could, and she had made it legal. I hadn't even reached the highway on-ramp when my mother called. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked in the tone I recognized from every major decision of my childhood, the tone that meant a conclusion had already been reached and my role was simply to confirm it, whether I had thought about how I planned to share the cottage with Aaron. I told her the cottage had been left to me. She told me that was exactly the kind of narrow, cold thinking that had always made things harder than they needed to be. I said I'd talk to her later and hung up. The following morning I drove up to do a walkthrough. 2 dock boards needed replacing. The kitchen faucet ran slow. The whole place smelled like cedar and old sunscreen, and somehow still like her. I stood at the end of the dock with a coffee I'd picked up in Bracebridge and let myself breathe. Then I heard tires on the gravel lane. A white U-Haul came around the bend and parked sideways across the entire road. My half-brother Aaron climbed out of the cab, stretched like a man who had just finished a long but completely justified commute, and looked at the cottage with the easy assessment of someone who had already decided what went where. His girlfriend Tanya stepped out from the passenger side and immediately began tilting her head at the front porch the way you do when you're mentally replacing someone else's furniture with your own. Aaron spotted me at the end of the dock and raised one hand, casual, cheerful, entirely unbothered. "Hey," he called, "we figured we'd get a head start. You want to grab a hand with the couch?" I need to explain something about Aaron. He is 31 years old. He has not held steady employment since 2021. Over the years, he has described various projects and opportunities with a confidence that I came to understand meant the opposite of what it usually means, that the money was already gone and the story was still catching up to it. Howard and my mother had always treated whatever Aaron was currently working on as the thing that was finally going to come together, while my actual career, the kind where you show up, earn your increases, and put money away in a TFSA like a boring adult, was acknowledged with a politeness that stopped just short of warmth. Standing on that dock watching him cheerfully assume I would help move his sofa into my inheritance, I felt a very old and very familiar pressure, the expectation that I would shrink, step aside, make room for a person who had never once made room for me. I didn't touch the couch. I walked up from the dock with my coffee still in hand. Aaron, I said, you need to turn the truck around, you're not moving in here. He looked at me like I'd switched to another language. Mom and Howard sorted it out, he said. I mean, the cottage is basically the family's, right? You're in Toronto. You'll be up here, what, 4 weekends a year? The cottage is mine, I said. The title transfer was registered this morning. You need to leave. My mother's car appeared at the bend in the lane behind the U-Haul. She and Howard had been following at a distance, a detail I only fully understood later. If the boxes are already inside, if the couch is in the living room, it becomes so much harder to insist that none of this is happening. Momentum is a tactic. Howard stepped out first in the particular combination of golf shirt and cargo shorts he wore when he wanted to seem relaxed while being very certain of his own authority. He walked past Aaron like a site supervisor arriving to check on progress. My mother positioned herself between us, her voice modulated into the register she used when she wanted to sound like the reasonable one. We're not asking you to give anything up, she said. A few months just while Aaron and Tanya get sorted. You're barely up here. It's practical. It's practical for Aaron, I said. The answer is no. What happened next is the part I still find difficult to describe. Not because it was violent, but because of how completely it demolished a fiction I'd maintained for years. The fiction that underneath all of it, my family was basically decent and just occasionally misguided. Howard stepped forward, placed his hand on the front door handle and said, "We're going to take a look inside." I stepped in front of the door. He stopped. My mother made a sound of genuine shock, as though a piece of furniture had rearranged itself. Aaron stood back with his hands in his pockets, wearing the bored expression of someone waiting for a traffic light. "You're not," I said. "You're being completely ridiculous," Howard said. "I'm calling the OPP," I said. "If you don't move the truck and leave this property in the next 5 minutes, I'm reporting this as trespassing." My mother pressed her hand to her chest. "You would call the police on your own family?" "I would call the Ontario Provincial Police on people who are trespassing on my property," I said. "Yes." I dialed. I didn't bluff. The officer who arrived was professional and unhurried, and explained to Howard and Aaron with very clear language that the name on the land title was mine, that the estate had been probated, and that continuing to attempt entry was not an option they wanted to pursue. Howard held his composure for about 30 seconds after the officer started talking, and then his face did something I had never seen it do. It went completely still. The way a face goes still when the practiced responses run out. They left. The U-Haul scraped out of the lane and eventually disappeared around the bend. I went inside and sat at my grandmother's kitchen table for a long time. By that evening my phone had become unmanageable. A family group chat I hadn't known existed, aunts, cousins, Howard's brothers, had been activated, and my mother had apparently spent the drive home composing. According to her version, I had become cold and calculating since moving to the city. I had used legal paperwork to claim a property that the whole family had shared for decades. I had called provincial police on my grieving mother within weeks of a bereavement. The responses came fast. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 4 years typed 3 paragraphs about legacy and what my grandmother would have wanted. One of Howard's brothers said she would have been appalled by my behavior. Aaron posted a photo of Tanya outside a Mount Huntsville looking sad, captioned, "Had to cancel our moving plans." No words. It had over 40 sympathetic reactions by midnight. I read every message once, then I muted the chat, turned my phone over and opened my laptop. What I did next wasn't driven by anger. It was driven by something considerably colder, the recognition that this operation had been planned in advance. You don't rent a U-Haul on impulse. You don't arrive with a girlfriend and her throw cushions the morning after a will reading, unless you've had a plan for a while, which meant there was something I didn't know yet. I started with the Landlord and Tenant Board Public Records database. In Ontario, once an LTB order is issued, it's part of the public record. I entered Aaron's full name and the Barrie address I knew he'd been living at. The result came back in under a minute. An LTB order had been filed 8 weeks earlier. His landlord had applied for non-payment of rent. The hearing had concluded, the order had been issued. Aaron and Tanya were required to vacate. The arrears were 4 months' unpaid rent, approximately $8,400. Not a single payment had been made. I sat with that for a moment. Their situation wasn't a lease quietly expiring or a landlord choosing not to renew. They had been formally evicted. They had known for 2 months that they needed somewhere to go. And instead of finding a new place to rent, paying first and last, getting on a wait list, doing any of the ordinary things adults do when their housing situation changes, they had done nothing, because Howard and my mother had already told them the cottage was available. I kept going. Aaron's social media profile was public. I scrolled backward through the past year. In January, he and Tanya had gone to Cancun. Poolside photos, resort bracelets, the kind of casual excess that reads as abundance when you don't know what's underneath it. In February, there were posts about leveling up, paired with screenshots from one of the Ontario sports betting platforms that launched after single-event wagering became legal in the province. Big wins. The kind of screenshots people share when they're trying to maintain a story about themselves. There were no screenshots of the losses, but the losses were there in other ways. By March, the betting posts had gone quiet and been replaced by the particular genre of motivational captions that people post when something has gone wrong and they're not ready to say so. In April, the LTB application was filed. I opened a second tab and searched the Provincial Personal Property Security Act registry. If a private lender registers a security interest against a borrower, the way someone might if they gave a significant personal loan and wanted some protection, it appears in the public record. I searched Aaron's name. One result: a private lending agreement registered 6 months ago, the principal $42,000. The creditor was not a bank. I got up and made tea. I needed a minute. The creditor on a $42,000 loan registered against my half-brother was Howard. My stepfather had lent his son $42,000, and that loan, according to the registration status, was in default. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the lake. The dock was still. A loon called somewhere to the left. I drank the tea slowly. Then I understood the whole architecture of it. Howard was not trying to help Aaron rebuild his life. Howard was trying to recover money he couldn't afford to leave outstanding. If Aaron moved into the cottage, no rent, no deposit, utilities running on the property's existing accounts, Aaron could direct whatever income he had back toward Howard to service that loan. Howard wasn't performing generosity. He was protecting a financial position. And my grandmother's property, which she had left to me with her intentions, written in plain language and notarized and registered, was the instrument he had chosen to do it through. I was supposed to unknowingly absorb my half-brother's housing costs, so my stepfather could quietly recover $42,000 he'd lent to cover gambling debts Aaron had been hiding from everyone but him. I printed everything: the LTB order, the PPSA registration, dated screenshots of Aaron's betting posts lined up against the months the rent went unpaid. I organized it in a presentation folder I'd brought from the city, the kind I use for project handovers at work. Then Howard called. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said, the reasonable voice, the "we're both adults here" voice. "You've just lost your grandmother, everyone's raw, I understand." I said. "There's a family Thanksgiving dinner in October," he said. "The whole family. It would mean a lot to your mother if you came, and I think there's a version of this where you make a small gesture, hand over a key, let them use the cottage for the season, and everyone goes home feeling good. You'd be surprised how much goodwill that kind of thing builds." What he didn't say, but what I heard underneath it very clearly: "Be the accommodating one, let us have what we want and we'll call it love." I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I called the estate lawyer, Mr. Finch, and asked whether he'd be willing to attend a family dinner if I felt his presence might be relevant. He agreed without hesitation. Then I drove out to see Evelyn, my grandmother's closest friend, a woman who had known Francis for 40 years, and who lived in a small house at the edge of town. I didn't bring the folder. I brought apples from the farm stand on the highway and stayed for an hour. Near the end of the visit, I asked her one question. "Has Howard contacted you at all since my grandmother passed? Asked about the estate or about the will?" Evelyn set her teacup down with particular care. "He called me twice before she died," she said. "He wanted to know whether she'd ever discussed changing the will, whether she'd mentioned him or Aaron specifically." I nodded. "I told him," Evelyn said, "that Frances knew exactly what she was doing and didn't need his input. Canadian Thanksgiving is in October. My mother hosted it well, The good dishes, cloth napkins, the table extended into the living room with a folding insert, a centerpiece from the farmer's market. About 15 relatives, the usual mix. It was exactly the kind of table where Howard excelled, warm, full of wine, surrounded by people who'd known him for years and found him charming. He was good at these rooms. He always had been. I arrived on time. I wore the blazer I reserved for client presentations, charcoal gray over a white shirt. My mother looked at the outfit the way she always looked when I dressed professionally. Somewhere between impressed and inconvenienced, like competence from me was a response she hadn't prepared for. Mr. Finch was already there. I had introduced him as the lawyer handling the estate administration. He looked exactly like what he was, precise gray-haired, carrying a slim leather portfolio, and no one questioned why he was at a family dinner. The meal was civil in the particular way that meals are civil when everyone is waiting for something. Aaron and Tanya had driven down from Huntsville, where they were apparently staying in a short-term rental. Tanya wore a soft blue dress that I suspected had been chosen to project a certain impression. Howard carved the turkey. My mother refilled water glasses without meeting my eyes. After the plates were cleared and the pie was brought out, Howard stood up. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about my grandmother, warmly, convincingly, the way he talked about things he wanted to borrow emotional weight from. He talked about legacy and what it meant for a family to take care of its own. He was genuinely good at this. He had a way of framing the moment before he asked for something, so that asking seemed like the natural ending of a shared feeling. Then he looked at me. "Cassidy," he said. "I'd like to think that with a bit of time you've had a chance to sit with this. Aaron and Tanya are in a tough spot. The cottage is sitting empty through the winter. This is what your grandmother would have wanted, family looking out for each other. So I'm asking you, in front of the people who love you, to do the right thing. Hand over a key, let them use the cottage for the season. Let's put this to rest." The table looked at me. An aunt I barely knew nodded encouragingly. One of Howard's brothers half raised his wine glass. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I reached into my bag and took out the folder. I had made 8 copies. I stood up and began placing one in front of each adult at the table, steadily, without drama, the way I distribute project reports at work. Howard watched me with an expression that moved from puzzlement to something considerably tighter. "Since we're talking about doing the right thing," I said, "I thought everyone should have the full picture." I turned to the first page. Aaron and Tanya were formally evicted from their Barrie apartment 8 weeks ago for 4 months of unpaid rent. This is an adjudicated order from the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board. Their situation wasn't a lease ending, it was a legal removal for non-payment. This is why they needed somewhere to go. An uncle leaned forward and began to read. The second section is Aaron's public social media posts from January through April, with dates. I kept my voice level. He was using one of the Ontario sports betting platforms through that period. The dates of the posts align with the months the rent went unpaid. I'm not here to make a moral argument, but it's relevant context for how the arrears accumulated. Aaron had gone very still. The third document is a registration from the Provincial Personal Property Security Act database. It's publicly accessible. 6 months ago, Howard registered a private lending agreement against Aaron for $42,000. That loan is currently in default. I paused. "Howard, you weren't trying to help Aaron get back on his feet. You were trying to move him into my cottage so that whatever he earns can go back to you. You wanted me to cover his housing so you could recover your money. You made that decision without telling me, and without asking me. That's not family. That's a financial arrangement that you chose to make my problem." The table was completely quiet. Howard's hand, resting flat on the tablecloth, did not move. The dinner party version of him, the warm, unhurried one who always knew the right thing to say, had simply stopped working. Underneath it was something I was seeing clearly for the first time. A man who had planned for a particular outcome, and was watching it become the wrong one. My mother said nothing. She made a sound, somewhere between a breath and a word, and then said nothing. Mr. Finch opened his portfolio. The land title for the Skeleton Lake property was registered in Cassidy's name in June, he said, in the same tone he might use to read out a property tax assessment. The estate was probated without challenge. The property is hers in full. Any occupancy arrangement would require her written consent and, if it extended beyond casual use, would engage the Residential Tenancies Act. I'm happy to answer questions about the estate administration if that would be helpful. No one asked any questions. What followed was quieter than I expected. There was no scene, no raised voices, no one storming out. Howard sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the folder in front of him. My mother got up and went to stand in the kitchen, and I heard her making a call in a low voice. Aaron pushed his pie plate away. Tanya excused herself and came back with the particular look of someone who has been crying in a bathroom and is hoping no one notices. Evelyn, who I had quietly invited and who had arrived after dinner, was sitting near the far end of the table. She was 81 years old. She had known my grandmother since they were both in their 40s. She waited until the silence had settled completely and then said, without raising her voice, "Frances would have seen this coming. She loved you enough to try to protect you from it." The relatives found their coats over the next hour. The aunt who had sent me 3 paragraphs about legacy and what my grandmother would have wanted managed a brief moment of eye contact on her way to the door. Nobody apologized. Nobody said they'd been wrong. But something in that room had shifted permanently, and everyone at the table knew it. Howard's request for any access to my grandmother's estate was formally declined by Mr. Finch the following week. Without that, and without the free housing he had engineered to recover his private loan, his situation became his own to sort out. The property on Skeleton Lake remained mine. The consequences came the way real consequences do, not all at once but steadily. The short-term rental in Huntsville was expensive. Aaron and Tanya moved to a basement unit in Barrie, smaller than the apartment they'd been evicted from. Tanya's Instagram went quiet. Howard and my mother settled into a particular kind of silence, not the silence of resolution, but of two people who've been caught in something they can't talk their way out of and are recalibrating. I blocked my stepfather and my half-brother across every platform. I haven't decided yet what I want from the relationship with my mother. I haven't unblocked anyone else. In November, I drove back up to the cottage for the first time since summer. The lake had gone dark and the trees were bare. I replaced the dock boards. I had the faucet looked at. I brought food from the city and ate dinner at my grandmother's kitchen table while the light faded off the water. Evelyn came for coffee the next morning. We sat on the porch in our coats and she told me things about my grandmother I hadn't known. How funny she had been, how unsentimental about the wrong things, how she had a habit of writing important things down before she could be talked out of them. She picked well, Evelyn said, meaning the cottage, meaning me. I've been back 6 times since then. I've learned how to winterize the pipes. I fixed the light at the end of the dock. I planted something along the south fence that is supposedly cold-hardy to Zone 4, though I am watching it with some skepticism through its first winter. The place is mine, left to me by someone who knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote my name down. Maintained by someone who has stopped waiting for her family to acknowledge that what's hers is hers. Some things don't resolve in apologies. You collect them in other currencies, in the particular quiet of a lake at 6 in the morning, in coffee gone cold because you stayed on the dock too long, in the solid sound of a door closing behind you in a house that belongs entirely to you. I'm no one's safety net. My grandmother understood that before I found the words for it. The best thing I can do for her now is make sure she was right.